friend. I'll get to that later.
Yes, thank you for returning that book, by the way.
Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, said, "If you tell a big lie enough and keep repeating it, the people will eventually come to believe it. The lie can be maintained only for such a time that the state can shield the people from the political, economic, and/or military consequences of the lie. Thus, it becomes vitally important for the state to use all of its powers to repress dissent, for the truth is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus, by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state." July 4th is coming up here in a couple months, and to me, Independence Day is really a day both of celebration and also a day of reflection. A day of celebration for the relative freedoms we do still enjoy, but then the contemplation for the relative part. It is very evident for anybody with their eyes open, and I assume all of you here have your eyes open to some degree, that the world is kind of going to pot right now. Especially in the past couple of years since the COVID-19 lockdowns, and a lot of people have been opening their eyes to the corruption that is not just in our government, but worldwide. So a lot of people are asking, how did we get here? How did we get from our rights come from God to servitude to the government? How did we bridge that gap? So what I'm going to be doing is going over an article I wrote for my website about 2.5 years ago. And I recently updated it and went back and added some new information, and that's what I'll be going over for you all this evening, kind of going over the history you were not taught in school. And I'll start with going back about 340 years to the Great Fire of London, 1666. From September 2nd to September 6th, a massive fire raged throughout the central London, destroying the medieval Roman part of the city of London. In the end, more than 13,000 homes, churches, and halls and other buildings were destroyed, completely totaling and gutting about 15% of the city's housing at the time, and resulting in £1.8 billion in today's currency worth of damage. This cleared out land was used to build the modern city of London, resulting in the only parcel of land in the world that has no title deed. Yes?
Can you repeat what year that was?
1666. 1666.
Right.
I'll leave that. You can draw your own conclusions there. This small piece of land has its own laws, its own flag, its own defense, its own constitution, and its own police. I've heard that the now deceased, supposedly acclaimed deceased Queen of England, when she went into the city of London, she had to dress as a pauper. I have no way to prove that, that's just what I heard. This land is home to the Bank of England, the London Metal Exchange, Fleet Street, the FTSE Stock Exchange, Royal Mind, and the Old Bailey Courthouse. This has led many to believe that the fire was intentionally started to clear out the land for the city of London, although I have no way of proving that. What is interesting, however, is Parliament's response to the fire. As an effort to find out who had perished in the blaze, Parliament invoked the Sesquiquivir Act of 1540. For those who are unfamiliar, Sesquiquivir is an old French word meaning "this killed that life." Black's Law Dictionary defines it as the person whose life measures the duration of a trust, gift, estate, or insurance contract. As defined by the law of limited liability, the life of a trust is limited to 7 years. So what this basically did was it killed every man, woman, and child, or presumed them dead and assumed dead, and a trust set up in their place until they reclaimed that account, giving them 7 years to reclaim back their lives. Now we'll take a small jump in history, going ahead about 100 years to the founding of the United States of America. Contrary to popular belief, the 13 colonies did not split away from Britain solely for tax purposes. This was only one of the reasons cited in documents like the Declaration of Independence. One of the other reasons stems back to the Bank of England, when the main private bank at the time. The Bank of England, just like many banks before and most banks since, practiced what is called fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking is perhaps as old as banking itself. Bankers discovered that only a fraction of people ever came in to reclaim their reserves. Thus, the banks discovered that they could lend out more money than they had in reserves, thus making themselves more financially stable and more profitable. In today's world, I've heard that the banks can loan up to 10% of their reserves. So if you deposit 100 or if you deposit $1,000 in your savings account, they can lend out $10,000. If you or I do this, of course, we're arrested for fraud. But apparently if banks do it, it's okay. This practice was especially dangerous when more people came to withdraw their money from their accounts than usual. The banks will not have enough stores in reserve to pay them all, and thus people will rush to their own banks to withdraw their fair share in case their own bank runs out, and you have the spiral effect. And this is one of the causes for the 1929 Great Depression. This process can be artificially created, as was in the Great Depression, by those printing the money, restricting the amount of money printed each year by the banks, or by the banks calling in more loans than usual. Both of these scenarios lead to the money supply of the country becoming dried up and causing a depression. On one of his trips to England as an ambassador for the 13 colonies, Benjamin Franklin was asked why the countries were so prosperous. And his reply was that the colonies printed their own debt-free currency, called colonial script. Now it's to be noted that this is a fiat currency. This was not backed by gold or silver. It was basically printed to meet the demands of the market at the time and to make products more easily pass from producers to the consumers. Upon hearing this, the British Parliament passed the Currency Act of 1764, strictly prohibiting the colonies to issue their own money and ordering all taxes to be paid in gold or silver. Benjamin Franklin wrote in his autobiography, "In 1 year, the conditions were so reversed that the era of prosperity ended and a depression set in, to such an extent that the streets of the colonies were filled with unemployed." According to Franklin, this was the sole main reason that fueled the American Revolution. Before the Revolution, the American money supply stood at around $12 million. After the war, it ballooned to $500 million, making the money nearly worthless. In 1781, Congress allowed the financial superintendent Robert Morris, along with others such as Alexander Hamilton, to open their own private central bank, christened the Bank of North America. This bank closely modeled the Bank of England, and the value of American money continued to plummet, so the bank's charter was not renewed in 1785. In 1786, Congress held a Continental Congress, and it was here that the Constitution for the United States of America was drafted and enacted. Those such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were opposed to the idea of a central bank controlling the money supply of America. However, Gouverneur Morris, Robert Morris, Alexander Hamilton, and their cohorts convinced the other delegates not to give Congress the power to issue paper currency. Now notice this is different from coining currency. Congress has the right to coin currency in hard gold, silver, nickel, what have you, copper, but they did not include the right to print currency, and thus the Constitution is silent on the matter. In 1791, again at the behest of Alexander Hamilton, a new bank was chartered, called the First Bank of the United States, giving it a 20-year charter. Thomas Weiling was the president of this bank, just as he had been the president of the Bank of North America. Interesting how it was the same people running the same thing. In the first 5 years of its existence, the government borrowed $8.2 million from the First Bank of the United States. In that same period, prices rose 72%. Thomas Jefferson lamented at the time, "I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment to our Constitution taking away from the federal government the power of borrowing." I think we would all agree that would be a very good idea. In 1811, a bill was forwarded to the members of Congress. This is 20 years after the charter of the First Bank of the United States. The bill was forwarded to renew the charter for the bank. After a heated debate, Virginia and Pennsylvania demanded that Congress kill the bank. Even the press at the time criticized the bank's existence, yet despite the outcry to kill the bank, there was opposition from those who would see it continue. Some even suggest that Nathan Rothschild threatened that war would come to America should the banks be absolved. However, the renewal bill was defeated by a single vote in the House and was deadlocked in the Senate. James Madison was the president at the time, and he was a staunch opponent of the bank, and his vice president, George Clinton, broke the tie in the Senate, ending the bank's existence. In a matter of months, British troops were on American soil, resulting in the War of 1812. Of all wars in American history, how many of you have, I assume most of you have heard the war, how many of you know anything about the war? A little bit. You don't hear much about it in the history anymore these days. I wonder why. Since England was busy fighting Napoleon Bonaparte at the time, the war ended in a draw in 1814. However, this was far from the end from the central bank in North America. In 1816, 2 years after the war, Congress passed another bill creating yet another central bank, creatively named the Second Bank of the United States. This charter for this bank was virtually identical to the previous banks, giving another 20-year charter. At the end of these 20 years, the people had about enough of central banks. In 1820, Andrew Old Hickory Jackson, hero of the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, was elected president. President Jackson was no advocate of the banks and wasted no time in shutting it down. However, at the end of the charter was not until 1836, the final year of his second term if he was able to be reelected. Until then, he had to be content in firing over 2,000 government staff who were compromised, paid off, etc. by the banks. The banks, of course, were outraged and fired back. In 1832, the year of Jackson's reelection, they asked Congress to renew the bank's charter 4 years early. Congress complied, but President Jackson did not back down. His veto statement is now considered one of the great documents in American history. In it, he states, "Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens' independence would be more formidable and dangerous than a military power of the enemy." In the end, Jefferson won out, and Congress was not able to renew the bank in 1832. For the first time in a president's history, Jefferson took his presidency on the road. Up until this time, the presidents usually stayed at home looking all proper and presidential. Jefferson was the first president to really take it on the road and go to the American people. And his slogan was Jackson and no bank. The Republican Party at the time ran Senator Henry Clay against Jackson. Despite the banks dedicating $3 million to Clay, Jackson won by a landslide. With his re-election secure, Jackson began in earnest to eradicate the bank. He fired 2 consecutive Secretary of the Treasury appointees because they refused to begin transferring funds from the central banks to state banks. Again, the banks lashed out, tightening the money supply in America and causing a financial crash and depression. In 1834, the Senate censured President Jackson, the first time in history. The media blamed Jackson for the depression, yet he stood firm. In a fortunate turn of events, which included Pennsylvania coming out in favor of Jackson and the bank's head, Nicholas Biddle, being caught boasting about causing the financial crash in April 1834, Congress voted against the rechartering the bank and called for an investigation of the bank to see if it indeed caused the financial collapse. On January 8th, 1835, Jackson paid off the final installment of the national debt, becoming the only president in history to ever pay off the national debt. Coincidentally, on January 30th of that year, only a couple weeks later, Richard Lawrence attempted to assassinate the president. By the grace of God, both pistols misfired. Lawrence was found not guilty by reason of insanity, although he was later found boasting that powerful people in Europe put him to the task and said they would protect him if he would be in any danger. When the charter ran out in 1836, the Second Bank of the United States ceased functioning. Biddle was arrested and tried for fraud. He was acquitted, but he was tried shortly thereafter with different legal proceedings still occurring at the time. When asked what his greatest accomplishment was during his presidency, President Jackson famously replied, "I killed the banks." Indeed, he did it so effectively that it took 75 years for a central bank to be reinstalled in America. However, even though he had gotten rid of the international bankers in America, he had failed to eradicate the root cause, which is fractional reserve banking. And there was some financial instability during the 1800s due to many state banks practicing fractional reserve banking. But this period did indeed mark a great time of prosperity for the states of America. And it was here that the bankers resorted to their old tactics, war, to bankrupt the country. Despite popular belief, slavery was not the primary cause for the Civil War. It was certainly a factor, but President Lincoln himself stated in his inaugural address 1 month before the war, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it now exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no intention of doing so." Just like any war in history, there are many factors that caused the Civil War. Northern industrialists used tariffs to make it more difficult for the South to purchase the cheaper European goods. This caused Europe to halt cotton imports from the South, and the South was now paying more for the basic essentials while earning less from their cotton exports. What's more, the seeding of the southern states that divided the nation was not entirely an accident. Otto von Bismarck, the man who united Germany just a few years after the American Civil War, stated, "The division of the United States into federations of equal force was decided long before the Civil War by the high financial powers of Europe. These bankers were afraid that the United States would attain economic and financial independence, which would upset their financial domination over the world." Mere months after the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, the central banks loaned Napoleon III of France 210 million francs to seize Mexico and station troops along the southern border of America in order to take advantage of the war and to violate the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 and to return Mexico over to colonial rule. A weakened America, of course, would not be able to halt this colonization of the Central and Southern America. At the time, Britain moved 11,000 troops to Canada, and the British fleet went onto war alert, both poised to strike should their quick intervention be called for. America's fate teetered on a knife edge, and this is why Lincoln fretted so much about the Union, the state of the Union, and why he talked about more union with rather than the defeat of the South. It was more than just a difference of an opinion about slavery. Needing money to finance the war, Lincoln went to the bankers of New York for a loan. And they offered him a loan at 24 to 36% interest. Lincoln refused. Instead, he went to his friend Colonel Dick Taylor, whose reply was simple: "Just get Congress to pass a bill authorizing printing legal tender. Legal tender treasury notes and pay the soldiers using them." So Lincoln did. In 1862 to 63, Lincoln printed $450 million worth of these treasury notes, all at 0% interest to the federal government. Nicknamed greenbacks, these were printed in green on the back side to distinguish from other banknotes at the time. I find it interesting, these were in circulation until 1994, I believe. The bankers were furious, of course, and their sentiments were expressed in the Times of London, saying, "It will pay off its debts without debt, and be without debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry out its commerce. It will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world. The brains and the wealth of all countries will go to North America. That country must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy in the globe." Doesn't sound so bad to me. This campaign was effective, however. In 1863, with the northern and southern troops positioned for the decisive battle of the Civil War, Congress needed more greenbacks to finance the war. Lincoln allowed the bankers to push through the National Bank Act, allowing these national banks, to operate under a tax-free status and to have a monetary power to create a new form of currency, banknotes. Greenbacks were still in circulation, like I mentioned, but no more were printed after 1863. More importantly, however, from this point forward, the entire money supply of America was created out of debt by bankers buying U.S. government bonds and issuing them reserves for banknotes. Historian John Kenneth Galbraith explained, "In numerous years following the Civil War, the federal government ran a heavy surplus. It could not pay off its debt and retire securities because doing so meant there would be no bonds to back the national banknotes. To pay off the debt was to destroy the money supply." Later in 1863, President Lincoln received unexpected aid from Tsar Alexander II of Russia. Alexander II had refused a national bank to be founded in Russia, and should America survive, the Tsar's position would remain secure. If America was successfully split and put back under the power of the European banks, the banks would attempt to take down Russia as well. Thus, the Tsar proclaimed that should either France or England give aid to the South, Russia would view it as an act of war, and sending the reports to San Francisco as a precautionary measure. Lincoln was reelected in 1864, and had he lived, he may well have destroyed the monopoly that the bankers had held once again in America. Like Jackson with him, of course, an attempted assassination was had. Unlike Jackson, however, the assassination was a success. After the assassination, Otto von Bismarck lamented, "The death of Lincoln was a disaster for Christendom. There was no man in the United States great enough to wear his boots. I fear that foreign bankers, with their craftiness and tortuous tricks, will entirely control the exuberant riches of America and use it systematically to corrupt modern civilization. They will not hesitate to plunge the whole Christendom into war and chaos in order that the earth should become their inheritance." What have we seen in the last 150 years? With Lincoln gone, the banks strove to strengthen their hold in America. In a speech given to the Canadian Congress on May 2nd, 1934, Gerald G. McGreer stated that Lincoln was assassinated only to reestablish the International Bank in America. Not only to reestablish the International Bank of America, but also to get America back on the gold standard. Gold which they controlled. McGeer stated, "Within 8 years after Lincoln's assassination, silver was demonetized and gold was the standard for the monetary system." The reason why they chose gold rather than silver is because silver was plentiful in America, whereas gold is traditionally scarce worldwide, which makes it far easier to monopolize and to control. With the market on gold sufficiently cornered, the multinational banks set about to enslave American people themselves. Going back to the founding of our country, as Kian mentioned earlier, our country started off as a constitutional republic, not a democracy. This is a very significant difference because in a constitutional republic, everybody, including the government, has to follow the Constitution and the laws. Whereas in a democracy, the majority can simply vote to get rid of the Constitution. As I just stated, the country started off as a constitutional republic. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, you will find the name of this republic, the States of America. You will notice that united is not capitalized. This is because it is a simple adjective saying that the states united. The United States of America. States are sovereign and have their sovereign rights given by God because they were created by humans to serve humans. You as a human being have sovereign rights that are given by God, and this is extremely important as we would consider the following. 1871, Congress passed the District of Columbia Organic Act of 1871, also known as the Act of 1871, which established Washington, D.C. as its own city-state, much like the Vatican and the City of London, and limited its authority to the 10 miles squared that it was allocated. More importantly, it established the United States, capital U, capital S, United States, or United States in all capital letters, so capital U, capital N, capital I, etc., as a corporation. 28 U.S. Code 3002 defines United States as a federal corporation, an agency, department, commission, board, or other entity of the United States, or an instrumentality of the United States. The seat of this corporation, its president of the corporation, sits in Washington, D.C. The sovereign states of America and the corporation of the United States are two entirely separate entities. If you claim you are a citizen of the United States, you claim to be a citizen, a resident of Washington, D.C. And you are therefore subject to whatever laws and statutes they pass. Ever since I learned this information, I have become very intentional about distinction between the United States and the sovereign states of America in my writing and in my speaking. Since the War of 1812, the sovereign states of America have not declared war on any foreign country. It is the Corporation of the United States, which everybody thinks is the country founded in 1776, that has been the front duping the American national sovereign people into its corporate system. The United States is the de facto government, while the States of America is the de jure government. This is done through the consent of the people, no less. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed in Congress. In the years leading up to its passing, several financial panics were incited with help of bankers such as J.P. Morgan. What the Federal Reserve did was it handed over the nation's monetary supply out of the hands of Congress and put it directly into the hands of into the jaws of a private corporation headed by supranational bankers like the Rockefellers, Morgans, and Rothschilds. It is no more federal than Federal Express and has very little in regards of reserves. What the Federal Reserve does is it prints currency, loans it to the government, then charges interest on the currency loaned. This constitutes the vast amount of our country's debt at the moment. During the Civil War, as you remember, President Lincoln printed these greenbacks. This was a constitutional way of printing the money because it was passed through Congress and had no attached interest to pay off later. What the Federal Reserve does is it literally prints currency out of nothing. It's not even backed by gold or silver. This is what has caused the massive inflation that the country has had since the Federal Reserve was founded. From the time the Pilgrims settled America until 1913, there was zero net inflation. Sure, there was fluctuations in the market during wars and so forth as more money was printed, but the market always stabilized back to a happy medium. After 1913 and during and immediately after World War I, inflation increased dramatically. Of course, the Great Depression caused a deflation, but World War II drove the interest way back up as the war industrial complex was churning out more and more machines and manpower. The Federal Reserve was used to help fund the war during World War I. After World War I, the United States Corporation was becoming bankrupt, so in 1923, the Great Depression was deliberately fabricated so that the populace would not suspect what was going on, as well as to get their minds off of how they were fooled into World War I with events such as the Lusitania. Another topic. Winston Churchill, I've heard, was even flown into New York City to witness the stock market collapse. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration did two more things to further enslave the American people by selling his New Deal to the public. First, he called in all of the gold and silver. In fact, he called in all of the gold and silver in 1933 and replaced it permanently with paper. The pretext, of course, was because gold and silver coins are so heavy and there were holes in your pockets and you don't want to carry around these gold and silver coins. Yeah, carry around paper is much more convenient. Now you carry around a little plastic card, and kind of the same idea. In doing this, he robbed the people of real, lawful money and replaced it with useless paper. And as a matter of fact, the Trading with the Enemy Act was amended to include citizens of the United States if they own gold. So if you own gold as a citizen of the United States, you are an enemy of the United States. Before this time, you could trade in your paper currency for silver and gold. In fact, if you look at a $10 bill, specifically a $10 bill from 1928, it says, redeemable in gold on demand at any United States Treasury, or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank. A couple interesting things to note about this. It says redeemable in lawful money. Any thinking person would say, well, is this not lawful money? Well, of course not. Lawful money is gold and silver. After Roosevelt called in the gold, you could no longer trade in your paper for gold at a bank. These banks printed during and immediately after, the bills printed during and immediately after this said, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money at the United States Treasury or at any Federal Reserve Bank. Notice it still says you can trade it in for lawful money, but it no longer says that you can trade it in for gold. And I heard a story, a guy sent in a dollar bill from that time period to the Secretary of the Treasury or whatever the office is that handles that. So I would like to redeem this in lawful money. So he received back a silver certificate, which still says you can redeem it for lawful money. He sends it back again. He says, I want some lawful money. And he gets a letter back in the mail saying, please be advised, Congress has not decided what lawful money is.
Is that the same as what a woman is today?
Yeah, I guess you could put it in the same category. And now, they don't even say you can trade it in for lawful money anymore. Now it just says, if you look at any bill, it says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Well, what on earth is legal tender? It reminds me of tinder, something you start a fire with. I once heard that the United States was one of the only countries in the world to make a perfectly fine commodity like paper, puts a little ink on it, make it totally useless. The second thing that the Roosevelt administration did was it gave all of those who are willing a Social Security number. This created what is known as a straw man, after the straw man from the Wizard of Oz, which has no brain. Your straw man is a fictitious legal person / corporation that the government made in your name and does business through. Your straw man can be identified easily because it has its name in all capital letters. So, for example, my name, kind of like you see here, all capital letters. That is the last name of my straw man. My true name is capital A, lowercase letters. Recall the Great Fire of London in 1666 that we started off with. Remember how they created a trust in the place of those affected by the fire? This is what the US government does when they give you a birth certificate. And the way they're able to do this is by using what is called the law of the sea. There are two different kinds of laws that govern the world. Those based on the law of the land and those based on the law of the sea. The law of the land is called common law or natural law. maritime law is the law of the sea. It's also called admiralty law. It's also called the UCC, United Commercial Code. Common law preserves the inalienable rights of those on land. Maritime law grants rights that are legal to conduct merchant banking, corporate, and international commerce. Common law defines what is lawful. Maritime law defines what is legal to conduct commerce and transcends national boundaries legally. You may say, well, I live on land, so admiralty law doesn't apply to me. Well, this is where you're incorrect. They have tied this in a very tricky, subtle way using the English language. Ships traverse water. All ships are referred to as female. Thus, women are ships. The man is the fabricator. Man delivers semen to the woman, the vessel, who carries this live stock for 9 months. At the end of the 9 months, the woman's water breaks and she goes into a hospital to give birth. In Black's Law Dictionary, hospital is akin to a bank or a church. When a ship comes into dock, it is tied off at berth. The captain submits a manifest of berth to the dock master. This manifest is a list of items that are being delivered. The dock master signs the manifest, claiming the shipment, including all livestock, as property of the ward. When a woman arrives at a hospital ward, the woman delivers the livestock through labor. The dock master, the doctor, will untie the cargo from the ship by cutting the umbilical cord. And by signing the certificate of live birth, the parents are informing the doctor that the stock has been delivered and can be claimed by signature. The doctor signs the certificate, making you property of the ward and making you lost at sea as unclaimed corporate property.
And the mother is named as informant. You are not a parent or anything else. You are an informant.
In your quote-unquote absence, the U.S. government creates this fictitious legal person to represent you in all of their commerce. You have tied yourself to this straw man in a number of ways, including your birth certificate, driver's license, marriage license, income tax, hunting license, W-4 forms, all of these licenses and forms where you're tying yourself to this corporate entity. What most people do not realize when they're discussing fighting for freedom and they're doing these protests and marches to free the American people, what they do not realize is that being tied to this corporation keeps them in bondage no matter how much yelling and screaming they do. Remember when I said that the head of the United States Corporation is in Washington, D.C.? Well, your straw man also resides in Washington, D.C. Your straw man is a citizen. Your straw man is a citizen of the United States. You are not a citizen of the United States as your own flesh and blood because you do not live in Washington, D.C. As a citizen,